I'm going to talk pretty soon after a few people get a chance to get here about how uh, dishonest it is, even for scholars, to say that they think Jesus was a regular person or that he was a real person. You see, most scholars take the position, there's a mainstream accepted scholarly position that Jesus was a real person, but the myths and legends and miracles associated with him are not reliable. And what I'll just give you those of you that are here, I'll give you the quick answer. There's not a single testimony that Jesus was a real person who did not perform miracles. You see, everything we have about Jesus, in fact, it all starts with the biblical text, which are definitely claiming that Jesus was a supernatural person, not a regular person. But when the scholars universally recognize that the Bible is myths and legends and not true history, that discredits them as a source, because when you write about mythological characters with mythological abilities, then you contradict your stories about who this person was, when he was born, when he died. Everything about Jesus is contradicted in the Bible. This discredits those sources as reliable, and then we have no contemporaneous witnesses or testimonies for the existence of Jesus of any kind. So it's not just we don't have contemporaneous testimonies for the miracle Jesus. We don't have, even more so, we don't have a single testimony that Jesus was a real regular person. The only thing you can do is Josephus is completely thrown out, because Josephus is not a credible testimony for Jesus of any kind, because scholars acknowledge it's not authentic to Josephus. Then that leaves you with stuff like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Pliny, and they didn't even mention Jesus at all. They mentioned Christians who is that out there walking? Who worshipped a man as if he was God or something like that, or a man named Crestus, which wasn't Jesus' name. So, and then that's it. There's nothing else. You've got the biblical text, and then you've got four very, very weak and discredited outside references, and then all you've got is Christian testimony from the 2nd century or later. We have absolutely nothing from the 1st century at all. There's nothing Christian at all in the 1st century, including the letters of Paul. So the letters of Paul do not date to the 1st century. We have no evidence whatsoever that the letters of Paul were written in the 1st century. The very first time the Pauline letters ever show up in history, or ever are cited or quoted or referenced in any way, is in 144, when Marcion made reference to it. Most scholars who are atheists would not agree with you. So those scholars who are atheists will definitely tell you that they can't prove that Jesus existed. They will definitely say that. And what they will say is, we think that Jesus was a regular person because so many people wrote about him. This is their argumentation. They say, well, we've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and all of Paul's letters, and then we've got, and these were written by different people, but they will say, well, none of them are eyewitnesses, none of them were contemporaneous, meaning that they didn't even live at the same time as Jesus. So these atheist scholars will tell you that we do not have any contemporaneous or eyewitness testimonies for Jesus, but simply because there were a bunch of people that wrote about him and said that he was a miracle man. Now, this is the problem. When you say people wrote about a miracle man, but we don't believe the miracle man was real, and this is the mainstream scholarly position, that Jesus was not a miracle man, because they say there is nothing that provides any credibility or validity to the claim that Jesus was a miracle man. We simply, and here's what Christians do. Christians simply blindly believe the claims of the Bible, even when we can prove the claims of the Bible are false. When the Bible says you can heal the sick or get whatever you ask for in prayer, or that there will be perfect unity among all the believers, all these claims are false, verifiably false. So we know that the Bible is not credible because it says things that we can verify are false. We have never been able to verify any miracle of any kind whether it's the parting of the Red Sea, the 10 plagues of Egypt, or Elijah bringing fire from heaven, or the walls of Jericho falling down, nothing has ever been verified. And there is nothing that any Christian can do or will do today to demonstrate that God is real through miracles. My claim is a little different than Jaren's. So me and Jaren are very similar on a lot of things. The only thing we differ on is I say that the Romans created Christianity as wartime propaganda, and he has no explanation for why Christianity started. He just thinks some random nobodies created a religion in the Roman Empire, and it was not detected or known by the Romans. So that's me. That's the only difference between me and Jaren. We agree about everything else. We agree about the facts. We agree about the evidence. We agree that Jesus never existed, that Paul never existed. The only difference is he won't say that the Romans created it as wartime propaganda, and that is definitively what happened. The Romans and the Jews were actively engaged in 70 years of major war and conflict, and then it's only after the war in 135, the final war between the Romans and the Jews ended in 135, and there's nothing Christian before that. Nothing. So not Clement of Rome, not Polycarp, not Ignatius, not Paul. Nothing existed prior to the war. Nothing. So there are Christians and even scholars that will say, oh, we think Mark was written in the 70s and Matthew in the 80s and John in the 90s. But they have no evidence for that. They're simply dating these gospels as early as they possibly can because they make a living off of Christianity. They're deliberately trying to shore up the possibility that Christianity could be a legitimate movement, even when all these scholars that are at least trying to be a little bit honest with the evidence are atheists or ex-Christian. So when you read from a Christian apologist, of course they're going to say, "Oh no, we've got things that date way back earlier than that." But when you ask them for the evidence, they can't provide it because it doesn't exist.
Oh, you look hot, can I just say?
All right, yes.
Hello?
What's up?
So, why does why does it say Jesus died for your sins when Yahweh never dies?
Well, only the truly most ridiculous Christians would even say Jesus was Yahweh. I mean, the way
So,
the Bible is written, Jesus was supposed to be the son of Yahweh. That's the way it was written.
so
But
you believe Jesus,
Christianity changed over time.
do you believe Jesus is God?
No, I believe the Bible is mythology and propaganda, and that Jesus never even existed. But the Bible says definitively over and over that Jesus was the Son of God. Even in the mythology, he was not God; he was the Son of God.
I mean, if he was the Son of God, then that means Jesus would also be a God because
A God. So correct. So if
I
Jesus was an offspring of a God, then that would make him a God, but not
okay,
the God.
okay, you're smart, but um if that means he's another God as well, if you understood.
Correct. So Christianity actually is polytheism. So Christianity says that Jesus was God and
Wow.
that he's different than Yahweh, but he is the same essence. Therefore, he's saying we've got more than one God. They believe in three gods.
Yes. So what should this is their excuse. What should I say to them?
Well, there's the argument to defeat every single one of their arguments for the Trinity. You can just simply say the Bible never even teaches Trinity, uh, and the word Trinity doesn't even exist in the Bible, and
Also,
even their definition of the word. So their creed, which is called the Athanasian Creed, that God is three in one and that they're all equally God and all this. Uh, that wasn't even adopted by the church until the like the 4th century or 5th century. So it wasn't even Christian doctrine for 400 years.
Okay, so I mean, why aren't you Muslim then? If you're that smart.
Because the Quran is exactly like the Bible. It's just human authored mythology designed to control and manipulate people with false claims of a God.
No, I don't think it's like that. Name a verse that you think is a contradiction. Do you think the Quran has contradiction?
Absolutely.
Okay, what
Um,
ones?
so it says that God created man in 5 different ways.
Uh, yes,
He
he meant
created
like
it with mud. He created it with dirt. He created it with a blood clot. He
yes,
created
all
it out of
together.
nothing, and he created out of sperm. And it says that sperm comes between your kidneys and your backbone, or something like that, which is false.
No, yes, I hear a lot of disbelievers talking about that. I know that's not a contradiction. You're just probably reading it wrong,
So
or
you're doing the
you're
same
just
thing Christians do. So Christians say exactly the same thing as you. They say there's no contradictions in the Bible, but yet when you point out the contradictions in the Bible, they do exactly what
okay.
you're doing and
Actually, give
say,
me that
no,
verse
that you
then.
just don't understand the Bible.
Okay, give me that verse then.
I don't have it on off memory.
Okay,
So all you got to do is just look up what are the 5 ways that the Quran says that God created humans, and you'll get your answer.
no, I'm gonna get the backbone stuff. The
Oh, well, just Google that. Say, where does the Quran say sperm comes from?
yeah. Um, so what kind of Christian are you?
I'm not a Christian at all.
Um, okay. So
I'm an
you're
atheist. I do not believe in invisible magic man in the sky that picks favorites for whoever believes in him, and promotes genocide and war in the name of religion, trying to conquer the world and force everybody to accept their God. So this is the problem with humanity, is that they're so weak-minded and gullible that they're willing to support the invisible man in the sky that doesn't even keep any of his promises.
mhm, okay. Also, they say like there's three person in one God. How
It makes no logical sense. So
that
I'll at
literally
least give you this. I believe that the Muslim explanation of God is actually more consistent and logical than the Christian explanation of God. The Christian explanation for God is completely illogical and nonsensical. They can't even make sense of it. They just say, well, even though you can't really understand it because God is just so complex, you can't understand it. But yet they think that we were created after his image. So if God is so complex, how come he's not? If we're made after his image, he ought to look like a human.
um well, I'm not like a scholar. I'm not really that smart, but a little bit. I
How
think
old
you
are you?
should. I'm 19. I think you should study Islam more.
No, I
Uh,
shouldn't. I've studied it enough. In chapter 4, in fact, I read the first 4 chapters of the Quran on my YouTube channel, so you could go listen to me read the first 4 chapters, and I got so disgusted with the horrible, disgusting nature of the book that I couldn't even read it anymore. Chapter 4 says, whenever Allah throws you in hell for unbelieving, then He's going to melt your skin off of your body, and He will give you new skin just so he can
yes.
melt it off too.
I mean, no, because they're disbelievers. You have to understand that. And
Yeah, so there's nothing
so,
wrong. So do you think? So you don't believe what Christians believe? Do you think it would be appropriate for Christians to melt your skin off because you
um,
disagree with them?
no, if my religion was true, then it's true. If their religion was true, then it's true. And if I knew Christianity was true
Okay,
and I still
so
reject
you're
it,
assuming. So okay, so now even if Islam is true, do you think that it's appropriate to melt people's skin off who just
yes,
don't think it's true?
yeah. If they agree that,
Okay,
if they
then
come,
then you're a disgusting person, and I have no respect for you.
no, listen, listen.
No,
Uh,
sorry. I do not respect anybody who thinks that torture is an appropriate response to unbelief. I have no respect. You will not spend a second on my life if you think that it's appropriate to torture people simply because they don't believe a story. I tried to let somebody else up, but they didn't make it. So I'll get back on topic. So what I was talking about is the evidence for Jesus. See, I do not believe Jesus existed in any way. And I remember when I was doing this study initially, looking at Matthew chapter 4, verse 24, that says Jesus was so popular. This is early in his ministry when he was in Galilee. In Matthew chapter 4, it says Jesus was so famous and popular for healing everybody of all their diseases that many people brought their sick and maimed to him from all over, from Syria and Damascus and Samaria and Judea and across the Jordan. Jesus was supposed to be so famous that people were bringing their sick to him from all over. But not a single person wrote about it at the time. Not a single person could go back and write and say, I visited this healer that was in Galilee in the 30s, and my son had leprosy or whatever it was that he had, and he healed him. It doesn't exist. There's no historical record of this famous healer. So, and then the Christians want to believe that the Gospels that are in the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written at the end of the first century. Well, Christians want to believe it was written by eyewitness people who were alive in the 30s, but this is absolutely not true. We know it's not true, and we know why Christians want to believe it, because they want to believe that Christianity is true. But when you look at the evidence objectively, unbiased, and you say, what does the evidence say? Do we have any manuscripts or any references or citations or quotations to the Gospels in the first century that we can verify happened in the first century? The answer is no. So Josephus was manipulated by Christians. Suetonius and Pliny the Younger never even mentioned Jesus at all. And they weren't even first century. So Tacitus, Suetonius, and Pliny were early second century, like in 110 or 115. And we can't even verify that they wrote the things that are attributed to them, because the earliest manuscripts we have of Tacitus, Suetonius, and Pliny are 1,000 years old, which gives the Christians more than enough time to try to add a sentence or two to support their religion. So when you find out that we have absolutely no original first or second century manuscripts of anything Christian, it does not exist. The earliest manuscripts of anything, the earliest manuscripts of the Bible that are in complete form is from the 4th century. The Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. These are 4th century documents that are the earliest complete New Testaments that we have. And then when you look at Tacitus and Suetonius and Pliny, the earliest manuscripts we have of those are from the 10th or 11th century. That's 1,000 years after they were supposedly written. That means they had to be copied and copied and copied by scribes, by Christian scribes at that. So the Roman Empire was a Christian empire, and all these documents were preserved by the Christian Roman Empire. So we know that Christians and the monks were the ones that were, doing all this copying of text, because that's all they had to do, sit in their monastery and copy text, and they most definitely made changes. The Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 43a, explicitly records the execution of Jesus. So, Trout Austin, go read Sanhedrin 43a. I wrote about it in my book. It talks about a man who was stoned, not crucified. It talks about a man that was not even crucified or unalived by Pontius Pilate. I don't think it mentions Pontius Pilate at all. And it says that there was a sorcerer who was brought before the Jewish Sanhedrin of Judges, not by the Roman council, but by the Jewish council. And the Jews had a 40-day proclamation that if anybody wanted to defend this sorcerer, then they needed to provide evidence that he was somehow innocent. Nobody came to his defense in 40 days, so they stoned him. So this is not the biblical Jesus. So there was a whole bunch of different Jesuses that were wrote about. But there's not the Babylonian Talmud never mentions the biblical Jesus ever, at all, in any way. So Sanhedrin 43 is the closest you can get, but it talks about a man who was not before Pontius Pilate, but went before the Jewish Sanhedrin, had a 40-day trial, and then he was stoned. That is not the biblical Jesus. And if you want to believe it's the biblical Jesus, then you're just not being honest because you want to believe that there's evidence for Jesus. There is no evidence for Jesus. There's no evidence today for Jesus because the Bible says if you believe in Jesus, you'll be able to heal people and perform miracles. You can't. So that's evidence that Jesus is fake. And even when you go back to the earliest documents that we can possibly find, there's still no evidence for Jesus. All we have is mythical stories that were written 100 years later, and we know that it's related to the war between the Romans and the Jews because it mentions the destruction of the temple. That's correct. Jesus never existed. And even the scholars, there are a bunch of scholars that take the position that Jesus never existed, but they've been blackballed by the mainstream scholarly community because the mainstream scholarly community actually benefits off of Christianity because they're teaching Christianity and Bible history in Christian schools. Bart Ehrman, who's retired now, was teaching Bible history at a college. And of course he's going to take a position that there's at least some validity and at least it's worth studying the Bible and Christianity because he's teaching people to become Christian historians. So he's got an obvious bias. So nothing is true because a scholar says so. Scholars argue and debate everything. And all scholars of history know that we can't know what happened 2,000 years ago. All they can do is calculate a probability, and the probability that there was a miracle man who resurrected from the dead in the first century is practically zero. I would say it's completely zero, but they would probably have to leave a little bit of doubt just for posterity's sake. All right, who we got? Craig, what's up?
Hey, how's it going? Yeah, I just kind of jumped in the last about 3-4 minutes there. I think it's been pretty solidly attested to of a historical Jesus. So there's, I mean, an entire field dedicated to this, and you mentioned Bart Ehrman. I mean, it's secular and as well as Christian scholars. I mean, it's pretty solid. I mean,
It's not solid at all. Have you studied it yourself?
Yeah, I have. I
So
mean, you
then
guys.
tell me what makes it solid because I'm very well familiar with all the evidence for Jesus, and it's not solid at all. It's not even remotely strong at all in any way. It's extremely weak. It's laughable. It's so weak.
But so there's a process that we have of rigor and academic scholarship of attestation of historical figures that's used. So like we can be very confident that Socrates, that Aristotle, that Alexander the Great, and that's why there's history books and societies are built on history and understanding. And with the same kind of rigor, those are used for the historicity of Jesus. You don't have to believe in the
Well,
resurrection.
that's the problem. So wait a second. You just stated the problem is they're using the exact same standards to make their opinions of whether Jesus existed as they do for Julius Caesar or Socrates, and that's the problem. Jesus is not in the same category as Julius Caesar or Socrates. Julius Caesar and Socrates were regular humans. They did not have superpowers. So it would be equivalent to saying, let's find out if let's compare Superman to George Washington. If people wrote a lot of things about Superman, in fact, if they wrote more things about Superman than they did about George Washington, it's more likely that Superman is real than George Washington.
Well,
Jesus is not in the same category as
yeah,
Julius Caesar.
fair point. And I don't think there's any kind of historical attestation to the miracles of Jesus, but an actual Jesus of Nazareth that was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Take away all the miracles, take away all the healings. Nobody's saying
now,
that.
Right. So let me talk to that point. The only sources that we have that say Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate are the exact same sources that say Jesus was working miracles and raising the dead and feeding 5,000 people with 2 fish. So you have to say, are these sources credible? And they're not. So you can't, it's inappropriate to strip away the miracles and say, well, it's possible that Peter Parker actually had, or let's say Luke Skywalker, because I remember his aunt and uncle, Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru, or whatever their names were.
Yeah, I don't remember the Star Wars.
It's inappropriate. It's inappropriate to strip away the miracles and use the same sources and say, we'll accept the natural claims, but we'll reject the supernatural.
Yeah,
What you have to
sir.
do is look at the sources and say, are the sources reliable?
And that's fine. I would answer in two ways. One, I would say, even with what you just said, the non-Christian, the secular historians like Bart Ehrman or whoever else, it's not just Bart, it's other people as well, would say, we are aware that the miracles are in there in these certain texts. However, we still believe, based on our academic rigor and our scholarship, that a historical Jesus still was
And
real.
but see, the problem is that there is not a single source. There's not even one source for Jesus as a regular man who didn't perform miracles. Every single source known to man
That's
is
not
saying
true.
that he was a supernatural character. And so
That's
you
not
can't,
true. Jo- Jo-
so
Jo- Joseph,
prove me
real,
wrong.
I don't mean to interrupt you, and I'm sorry, and I
Okay,
appreciate
no, no,
we
no.
have. I
So
appreciate you.
I don't want to overtalk too much, and also, so if you think I say something wrong, then I want to address that point immediately. Just like
Okay,
if you say something wrong, I want to address it immediately.
yeah,
I don't want to drag on. So
cool.
prove me wrong.
And by the way, thank you for having me on. So Josephus
Is a
is
known
mentioned
forgery.
in 93 A.D. He mentions
He
Jesus
didn't
as
mention. He didn't write about Jesus or
lem-
Christianity.
you're right. He didn't write about Christianity, but he mentions
No,
Jesus as a
no, he
wise man
didn't.
and the brother of James. He
No, he
does.
didn't. No,
Yes,
he
he
didn't.
did. Dude,
Okay,
I
okay.
mean,
So now,
I'm
are
looking
you?
at it right
Listen,
now. I'm looking at it right now.
you're
I'm
looking
looking
at
at
the
the
original
source.
manuscript that Josephus wrote with his own hand.
Okay, I don't have that, dude.
Okay, so now listen to me. Listen to me. This is a known Christian, what they call it is an interpolation. They know Josephus didn't write it. It is not even disputed or debated that this is not authentic. We know beyond a shadow of a doubt that that book 18, Antiquities of the Jews, it says it was about this time there was a man named Jesus, if it be lawful to call him a man, who was a doer of wonderful deeds, that who was crucified by Pontius Pilate and was seen again alive the third day, and he fulfilled this and 10,000 other prophecies, and there are Christians that are still alive today. That passage is called the Testimonium Flavianum. All scholars know that that's not authentic.
Okay,
It's not
okay,
authentic. Christians added it at a later time.
okay. How
Do you know
about
that?
okay? How about Tacitus?
Okay, so first of all, I want you to verify that you understand that the Testimonium Flavianum is a Christian manipulation, that they had to add Jesus to Josephus because it wasn't there to start with.
Well, your comment earlier was that Josephus was a forger. Is that what you said?
That passage, the Testimonium Flavianum, it's 125 words. I just summarized it a few seconds ago.
No.
Just that passage about Jesus is not authentic to Josephus. Josephus did not write that.
What I would say is you mentioned, again, I just want to be precise with everything here. You mentioned Josephus was a forger. He was not a forger. You could say maybe his documents were tampered with later, but he himself was not a forger. We have to at least get that straight.
So, what do you mean when you say he is not a forger?
Well, you said he was a forger. He said his
No, I
documents were
didn't.
forged.
No, I
You
didn't.
said Joseph. If I
I
missed it in the
said that
chat,
passage, the Testimonium Flavianum, is not authentic. It's not original to Josephus. Josephus did not write that passage. That's what I said.
okay, you said that later, but the first thing you said before you went into that was that Josephus was a forger, and then you mentioned the
No.
Flaviovus.
So now I never said Josephus was a forger. What I said is that passage, the Testimonium Flavianum, was a forgery. That Christians added it at a later time. Do you understand?
I understand what you're saying now, but I was
Right.
just making sure we were on the same page with
Yeah.
everything.
So it's
So I
good to
understand.
clarify.
Yeah, that's it. That's all I'm trying to do.
And so now, before we move off of Josephus, I want to talk about book 20, where it talks about the brother of James.
Okay.
So the word Christ, it never appears in all of Josephus except for 2 times. The word Christ. He didn't use that word in reference to, well, the word Christ as an adjective or whatever, as a title or a descriptor. Now, he did use the word to anoint. He said this was anointed and that was anointed, but he never used it in reference to Christianity, and he never used it as a title for a person, except for these 2 times. And so this is evidence that even the second passage was manipulated, when Christians were manipulating Josephus, that they also manipulated this little phrase, because the context of book 20, there's 3 or 4 paragraphs about a Jesus, and he was still alive, and he became the chief priest. It's called
Okay.
Jesus, son of Damnius. Even in the exact same paragraph, just the very next sentence after it says that this guy named James was unalived by the chief priest, and then Albinus, who was the governor, found out that there was an uproar in Judea, and he came back and found out that this high priest was unaliving people without authority, and then he removed him as the chief priest, and then he appointed Jesus, the son of Damnius, as the chief priest in his place. So Jesus was still alive, and Jesus is in the context of the passage, and Jesus is actually the main point of the entire passage. But it's not the biblical Jesus. So when the Christian forgers were going in and trying to manufacture evidence for Christianity, they took something that was about Jesus, the son of Damnius, and they said, oh, this guy, James, had a brother named Jesus, we'll say, who was called the Christ. All they did was just add that little parenthetical statement, who was called the Christ, because Josephus never used that word to talk about a person.
So if I could just respond, and again, I'm trying to learn these things on the fly here, but I'm putting in just to get an understanding of what you're saying. And this is what it came back with the Flavianum, and forgive me if I'm not pronouncing that right, the comment that you made. But it says the scholarly consensus in 2016, most experts believe the paragraph is substantially authentic. This means Josephus did write about Jesus, but Christian copyists later touched it up to make it sound more religious. So that's the scholarly consensus would say, yes, there was a touch up to your comment, but it wasn't a complete like rewriting his name in there.
Do you know? See,
what they're saying.
So I understand that they say that it's an interpolation, not a forgery. I say it's a forgery. There's a lot of scholars who take the position that it's a forgery, that the entire passage was added, because it doesn't make sense. So if you simply look at the logical common sense issue, I've read the passage, I've read the entire passage, what's before it and what's after it in the context. So in the paragraph before, it's not just a paragraph, it's a whole big long story about how Pontius Pilate was trying to take money from the Jewish treasury to build a water aqueduct into Jerusalem. He's like, hey, I'm going to bring water to Jerusalem. You guys ought to pay for it. The Jews said, no, you can't take money from our treasury. That's God's money. You can't take it. Well, he took it anyway. And there was an uproar in Judea because the Roman governor, took money from the Jewish treasury that they didn't want him to take. And it tells us how Pontius Pilate took care of it. When he brought all his soldiers in with daggers hiding under their cloaks, and when they went in to debate the issue, whether or not that he had authority to take money, he gave them a signal. I don't know what the signal was. He gave them a signal, and they all pulled their daggers out of their cloak, and they unalived everybody that was in opposition to the water aqueduct. All of a sudden, everybody's fine with the water aqueduct, and they put in the water aqueduct. So this is an elaborate story about how Pontius Pilate dealt with Jews that didn't accept Roman authority. Then you've got this tiny little passage. It's got 125 words. I've already summarized it. There was about this time a man named Jesus, if it's lawful to call him a man, who worked a bunch of miracles, resurrected from the dead and all that. Then you've got a whole nother story about how...
Do you mind if I jump in 1 second? Do you mind if I jump in 1 second?
Go ahead.
So, so to your point that you made earlier about there are some scholars that do believe it's a forgery, and some believe it's an interpolation. I think that's the word you meant. But I think the scholarly consensus is that it was an interpolation, not a forgery. So you might be right, dude. Like, you might be right. But you would, and you're doing it right now, and I appreciate it. You're going why you believe and you're defending it. But there's a scholarly field of PhDs and people that are in there for a particular reason, and they've contended with these as well. And it seems like, again, just what I'm reading here is that the consensus would be that it was not a forgery, it was an interpolation, that he was still in there. And you might be right. So
listen, I agree with you that there is apparently now. I'm just accepting that there is the mainstream scholarly position is that there was a hint of mention of Jesus, but we can't know what it was because we don't have the manuscripts. The only way you can know what was originally put there is if you had the original manuscript. But what I'm doing right now is telling you how what the evidence we actually know about and how we can argue with ration and reason as to what is most likely the case. And so when there's an elaborate story about a water aqueduct followed by an elaborate story about a man who tricks a married woman to sleeping with him in the Isis temple in Rome, which results in the destruction of the Isis temple in Rome, when you've got a tiny little insertion, boop, so even if you accept the mainstream scholarly position that Josephus just mentioned Jesus in passing, but he squeezed it in between the water aqueduct story and the Isis temple story, and he just said, "Well, this is when Jesus lived. Now let me tell you about Mundus." That's ridiculous because Josephus, if he was going to introduce a character, he would tell a story about him, and he doesn't even tell a story about him. So,
But to me, that almost lends a little bit more weight to it because he's not trying to, it's not a he's not making a religious point. He's just giving a
no.
historical mention that,
So
look,
no,
this was a
no,
person that lived. But real quick, I just want
no.
to say, like,
There's
the
wait a
reason
second.
why,
There's nothing credible at all about introducing a brand new character that you don't even tell who it is. It's insane to assume that Josephus would just say, "This is when Jesus lived. He was called the Christ. Now let me tell you something else, a completely unrelated story about a man named Mundus in Rome." That is not logical. It is not rational. It's not even remotely possible that he would just introduce Jesus. You know who wants Josephus to introduce Jesus? Christians.
right. I would agree with that. I would agree with that. But again, I think here's all that I would say. I think we got down this trail is because you had mentioned there's not any kind of like extra biblical sources or sources that don't mention his miracles that will also just like mention Jesus for who he is. And
There's
again,
no credible
dude,
sources. So there are a few
credible.
references to
Okay,
Christianity, but there's no credible
well,
sources that would make us believe that Jesus was a real person.
well, again, we didn't use the credibility before, but that's being used now, which is fine and that's legit. And maybe that was meant by what you said. But I think the idea is that this is something that you aren't like, I know you've done your research, but I don't think it's like a slam dunk case that there are non-biblical texts that point to Jesus that consensus of scholars believe in, and if you believe them as well, like you're crazy or something like that. I think it's okay to contend with it, like we're doing right now. And I'm not like irrational, and you're not irrational. I think there's enough behind it to say, look, I want to follow these. I want to listen to what is being said. It's possible that Jesus was a real person. I don't just think it's a slam dunk case,
Oh,
which is I
okay.
think
So
more
so
what you're making it.
let's talk about that for a second. So if you take so first of all, let me say nothing's true because the scholar says so,
I
especially a
agree. I
historical scholar.
agree. I agree.
So even if a whole bunch of scholars agree on a certain historical perspective, that doesn't mean it's true. It just means that uh, you know at very best, if you want to go against them, you need to study the evidence so that you can make a good case. So
I agree.
if I didn't know the evidence and I was just saying all the scholars are wrong, but I didn't know what the evidence was, that would make me a lunatic. I know what the evidence is. I know that they're saying something that they don't have evidence to back it up because
And
they
yeah,
discredit the Bible and then they use the Bible as their primary reason to even assume Jesus existed. But now this gets to the other point you brought up. If Jesus was a regular man and not a miracle worker, because this is what the scholars say. They say, we think that the stories are based on a real person, but we think the stories are exaggerated and fluffed up and they've been added all the magic. That's what they think. That's the
yeah.
scholarly consensus.
Well, and the only thing that I would just say to your comments is like, look, again, I'm not saying that you haven't done your research. You clearly have, and that's why I appreciate the conversation. But what I'm saying is, when you're mentioning what you're mentioning about how all this is kind of like it's not done the right way, and again, I'm not saying that this is necessarily wrong, but what you're doing is, you're impugning the entire, and you might be right. Again, you might be right, but you're impugning like this entire, group of this field of
Yes,
ancient
I
historians
agree.
that that.
I
But
believe
let me
scholars are
just say,
dishonest.
let me just yeah, and that's fine, and you might be right, like I said. but like I was kind of mentioning in the beginning, like we build like societies and we look back on history based on what we can, believe about Alexander the Great and Socrates. So it's like, so all of this could be kind of just one big scam. And so that's what you've got to contend with as well. And again, you might be right, but it has such major implications if all of this scholarship is complete, like a complete scam, and these people are all like essentially misreading it and they're foolish in their thinking. And like, that's a big leap to take. And again, you might be right, but like, that's the implication for what you're saying is it's not only were these things kind of wrong, but it's you're impugning like this
Yeah.
entire field, and
Yeah.
that's just a big thing to do. And again, you might be right, you might be proven right in the end, but we have like societies, like I said, I'm not going to repeat myself, built
So
on
so
looking at
so all
history
I
and studying it and all that.
all I'm so I don't expect anybody to believe me simply because I say it. What I'm begging people to do is to do the research instead of just believing whatever scholars tell you and just going with the majority. This is a fallacy. Appeal to authority and ad populum, saying, "Hey, I'm just going to say whatever's popular." This nothing is true for that reason. You see, I'm a lover of truth. I want to know what is true, and so I didn't just take anybody's word for it. I actually dug into the evidence to find out why scholars come to their conclusions. I've got a book right here that's written by Bart Ehrman, Did Jesus Exist? I read his book after I did my independent research and said, oh my goodness, Bart Ehrman doesn't even have a good argument that Jesus existed. He takes the position that the Bible is completely unreliable. It's full of contradictions and errors. It's not written by eyewitnesses. It's written by people who told a story, who told a story, who told a story, and repeated the story that they heard before them, and it's clearly mythology and unreliable. But when it says Jesus had a brother named James, and it says that he was baptized by John the Baptist, and that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate, I will just arbitrarily accept those statements because it doesn't require me to believe in miracles. Bart Ehrman simply strips away the miracles from the Bible and accepts the natural claims,
Correct.
and he has
Right.
no reason to do that. So if we had a census record, for example, from the Roman Empire that listed a man named Mary, a man named Joseph, and a woman named Mary who had two sons named James and Jesus, I would say that's pretty good evidence that we have historical evidence for the biblical Holy Family.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
don't have that. It doesn't
And,
exist.
and again, like I want you to understand, like I'm not trying to appeal to some kind of like authority fallacy or anything like that. Like at some point, like I was not there, and this is not a perfect analogy, but I was not there, to know enough about if George Washington actually existed. I'm sure he did, but I could go and I could do the research,
We got
but
way
but
better
then
evidence for George Washington.
yeah, and we do, but like you're not like a 1,000,000% sure because you can't. And I'm not. But the point
We
is
have
like,
actual descendants of George Washington still alive
sure,
today.
yeah, and I understand that. And again, this is not a perfect analogy. How about we go to like Alexander the Great? It doesn't really matter. My point is that at some point you are like looking at scholarship because you can't do all the scholarship for like every little detail of everything. And I know you've narrowed in on this Jesus thing, but I just don't think that everybody has to like it's okay to say that there are a group of people that are credible, that have upstanding careers, and they are not they've not had issues of forgery or lying or scamming themselves to take on faith some of these things. Now again, I know you're hyper focused on Jesus, but if we were to apply the same thing to Socrates, I know you don't like Jesus because of the miracles, but it's the same standard, it's the same rigor that we use for Socrates that we do for Jesus. It seems like you don't like the miracle part, and so therefore you're not willing to accept it. But the Socrates you are, because there's not this miracle and all these implications with it.
So
And like,
that's a huge difference. So do you see the difference if we're going to argue whether or not George Washington existed or Superman existed? There's a huge difference.
I well, I would say this. You again, the Bart Ehrman way, you strip away the miracles and did just a man named Superman live, and was he crucified under Pontius Pilate, or whatever. So I'm not trying to convince you of the miracles. I think that it's credible to have the position that a Jesus of Nazareth lived. Now the miracles and the resurrection is a different ball game, but like
All right.
the George Washington and the
But
Superman
wait,
stuff,
here
like
this is a question I wanted to ask you earlier. So now let's follow this idea that Jesus was a regular man that his followers loved, and when he died, they created these myths about him resurrecting from the dead. Let's follow this train of thought for just a second.
Okay.
So, just a hypothetical situation. Let's pretend that Jesus was a real person and that he actually did have a big following. And when he died, he stayed dead, but they wanted to create this myth that he stayed alive. So, what do you think would be the motivation for his followers to push this lie on the Roman Empire and eventually take over the world with it? What would be the motivation?
Well, you're not going to like my answer. It's because they saw the risen Christ.
Okay.
So I would say, so let me answer the question real quick. So I think all of the other, like, it was a myth, it was a lie, they stole the body. I think, or is it mass hallucination? I know Barnum believes in the bereavement hallucination. I think all of those fall flat. Like that most, again, scholars, I think most scholars, the consensus would be like, we don't know. Like, we don't know what happened on that Easter morning. Like, the idea is, like, nothing has come up yet to say definitively, okay, this is what happened with the body. Or, yes, it would have been a mass delusion. They all fall flat.
So let me ask you this.
Like, yeah, go ahead.
What do you think happened to the bodies of crucified victims? What do you think happened to them? Just as a standard practice, what do you think happened to the bodies of crucified victims?
So I don't know the answer to that, but I know for
Do you know
Jesus,
the purpose for crucifixion?
it was probably to instill fear into the citizens, I would guess.
Right. So it was actually not a common execution practice in the Roman Empire. They didn't even want to do it. It was reserved for the most heinous criminals that sparked rebellion against the Roman Empire. And the reason they were willing to go through all the trouble to crucify a victim who sparked a rebellion against the Roman Empire is because it was worth their time to let the body hang on the cross in public view, so that everybody that saw it would be deterred from rebelling against the Roman Empire. So it was like a billboard on the side of the interstate. And the cross didn't serve the purpose if the cross was empty. The only purpose that a crucifixion would show is if the body stayed on the cross and rotted on the cross until the birds were eating the flesh, and it started stinking so bad that they decided to pull the body down and throw it in a fire and burn it. That's what they did with the bodies. And so when the Bible says that Jesus was taken off the cross on the same day that they put him on it, that's not compatible with history. It's not possible that the Romans would crucify somebody because the Jews demanded it, and then they would take him off and put him in a brand new, never before used, freshly hewn tomb so that he could get an honorable burial on the same day that he was crucified. It's not remotely possible.
So again, I'm just on the fly here trying to figure out the idea that Jesus's body would have hung on the cross. So I'm just looking. It says there's no single consensus on this. Instead, the world of scholarship is split into two major camps, and which one you find legit depends on how much you trust the Roman rule book versus the Jewish context.
There is no account at all of anybody being crucified for 3 hours. It doesn't exist. The Bible is the only account of somebody being crucified for 3 hours.
Oh, you mean from the beginning, the lashings all the way to the death on the cross?
No, I mean from the time they put him on the cross.
So correct me if I'm wrong, and I don't know this. Does this Bible say he was on the cross for 3 hours? I don't know that answer.
Well, actually, the Bible contradicts itself, because if you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, if you read the accounts of the crucifixion of Jesus, they're all different. Some of them say that he wasn't put on. It was high noon, and this is when they first put him on the cross at noon, and they took him off by 3 p.m. or what they call the 9th hour. They say it was dark from the 6th to the 9th hour, and then he breathed his last, and then he gave up the ghost. So they contradict, which is more evidence that the Gospels are mythology instead of historical narrative. So they weren't written by eyewitnesses. And so just imagine somebody, even if the best case scenario, even what the mainstream scholarly position is, says that the first gospel was written in the 70s, and the one that we call Mark. So if that was the very first gospel written in the 70s, which we have no evidence it was written in the 70s, but even if that part's true, That's 40 years after the event, written by people, and even the Christian narrative says that Mark was not an eyewitness. Mark was just recording what Peter told him to say. So Peter told
Okay.
Mark, and Mark wrote it down 40 years later, and there's no evidence Peter existed. There's no evidence Mark existed. There's no evidence that the Gospel of Mark was written in the 70s. But even if you take best case scenario, it's extremely ridiculous that you would even accept this as a reliable testimony from a non-eyewitness 40 years later who is relaying hearsay evidence from supposedly Peter. That this guy
And
was...
and,
Go
and
ahead.
correct me if I'm wrong, but does Tacitus say that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate?
Yeah. So Tacitus
Okay.
says that Jesus, but he doesn't use Jesus. He uses the name Chrestus. He says that here's what Tacitus says. The whole purpose for Tacitus, and it's also just a little two-liner in Tacitus. He doesn't say anything about Christianity anywhere in all of his writings except for one tiny little place, and it's about this big, and I can almost quote it to you. He says that in order to get rid of this idea that Nero started the fire in Rome that burnt most of Rome down, he fastened the guilt on a group of people hated for their abominations, who called themselves Christians, and they got their name from a man named Chrestus, who suffered the most extreme penalty under one of our own procurators, Pontius Pilate. And then he says this mischievous superstition had its origin in Judea and made its way to where all things despicable come, from the city of Rome. It's weird that a Roman historian is calling Rome the despicable place, but
So
it's
so
also
you don't
weird.
think Tacitus is credible? Is that what you're saying?
So there's really good logical scholarly arguments that this passage is not authentic to Tacitus, because he. So we know that Pontius Pilate was a prefect, not a procurator. There's a difference. A procurator is like a guy who approves the budget. A prefect is the governor. And so Pontius Pilate was a governor. We found an archaeological find that's called the Pilate Stone, and it says Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea. And so, like, wow, that matches up with the Bible. That's like one of the only archaeological finds for that actually, has writing that verifies a character of the Bible. That's all it says, is that he was a prefect. Well, the Bible calls him procurator. So
So I had a question to what you were mentioning earlier. You asked me, I think, about, why would his apostles come up with this mythology? And you asked me, I said, because they saw the risen Christ. What would you think would be the reason for that?
so so I can't find a logical explanation for why. Well, so here's one thing. So if the apostles, like Peter, James, and John, if they thought Jesus was the Messiah and then he died and stayed dead, then maybe they were trying to save face all the people that they went around saying Jesus was the Messiah. And then when he died and stayed dead and he didn't accomplish anything, they said, you know what, guys, we weren't wrong. He really is the Messiah. He resurrected from the dead, and if you just believe in him, then you get to go to heaven when you die. Maybe that's a logical explanation,
But
but
wasn't kind of the historical record, again, you may not agree with it, but like that his followers were actually afraid after he had died, and they thought that they were coming next, and so it was more like they were afraid. And then, to your point, it was like, and then all of a sudden they became emboldened, like they just kind of got together and was like, hey, let's not let this thing die. Let's just like go out with this lie, like type thing, and just do our
so
deaths, or like
So
I don't
now
understand.
you're bringing up the other issue about whether or not Christianity was persecuted in the Roman Empire, and when you go read a book by a biblical scholar who's on TikTok, you can go ask her face to face because she's on TikTok. It's Candida Moss. She wrote a book called The Myth of Persecution. She teaches she taught at Notre Dame in Chicago or wherever that is, and she's currently teaching at the University of Birmingham in England, and she's English by nationality, I think. And she's also kind of cute, so she's kind of fun to watch and listen to.
That's rare
Uh,
in that
but she
field.
wrote a book that says it's titled "The Myth of Persecution," and she details what the actual historical record is regarding the persecution of Christians, and she says that it just doesn't. There's no credible evidence that Christianity was ever systematically persecuted by the Roman Empire. But what she points out is that these stories about the persecution of Christianity were told maybe 200 or 300 years after. So we don't know how Paul died. We don't have any early attestation to how Paul or Peter died. We have probably the earliest reference to the death of Paul and Peter was what we call Clement of Rome, First Clement. And all he says is that Peter and Paul have died and they've gone on to their reward. He doesn't say how they died. He doesn't even say that they were persecuted or martyred. He just says they died and gone on to their reward.
So do you believe Paul was real? Do you believe he was
No.
a historical person? Okay.
No.
Okay.
So, and the number one evidence.
I was going to say, like, I was going to jump off if you wanted to finish what you were saying, though, but go ahead.
Well, so Candida Moss tells about the myth of persecution, how these are just mythical stories that were intended to generate sympathy for Christianity in the Roman Empire. Now, let me give a real quick reference to Paul, because there's one data point that is extremely meaningful when we talk about the existence of Paul. And there's no historical record of Paul. There is no reference at all of any kind by anybody outside of Christianity who even attests that Paul existed. And the one that should have done it, that would have convinced me that Paul was a real person, would have been Josephus. Josephus was alive at the exact same time, about the same age as Paul, who lived in the same few decades in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. This would have been when Paul was famous and popular. It's also while Josephus was born in the 30s, so he would have been a teenager in the 40s, and he had been in his prime in the 50s and 60s. And he was a Jewish, a leader in the Jewish religion in Jerusalem in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Well, let's just say the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the exact same time that Paul would have been a prominent person. He never mentions him in any way, any shape or form. Never mentions Saul of Tarsus or Paul at all.
Got it. Okay, well, seriously, thanks for having me up and the back and forth, and you know, kind of my thoughts on things, and I obviously know yours. So yeah, I appreciate your time. Thank you.
So I wrote a book. You can get it for $5. You can get it on Kindle for $5 called Jesus Demigod. It's linked in my profile. So $5 is there's a guy named Kenneth Humphreys who is a biblical scholar who wrote a book titled Jesus Never Existed. That book is $100. Nina Livesay is a biblical scholar who wrote a textbook that's intended to be used in biblical seminary school at college that cost over $100. And she's saying that Paul never existed, and here's the evidence that Paul never existed. You can get my book for $5, and you can see the same things that you would learn from them for over $100.
Cool. Thanks, man. Really appreciate you.
All right. Have a good day. Thanks for stopping in.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
The Max